I never thought my failing relationship podcast would lead me to love. But there I was, standing in the scorching Aurora summer heat, staring at the towering roller coasters of Embellished Gardens. My producer had suggested I needed fresh content. "Your listeners are tired of hearing about failed Tinder dates, Callie," she'd said. The screams from the Thunderbolt caught my attention. My heart raced as I watched the cars plummet down the steep track. That's when I saw her, blonde hair whipping in the wind, hands raised high. Even from below, her joy was magnetic. "Single rider?" The attendant's voice snapped me from my trance. "Yes," I managed to squeak out. They paired me with the blonde woman I'd been watching. "I'm Mary," she said, flashing a smile that made my stomach flip more than the upcoming drops. "Callie," I replied, gripping the safety bar. "Please tell me this was a good idea." She laughed, a sound that somehow cut through the mechanical whirring. "Trust me, honey, sometimes the scariest decisions lead to the best stories." The ride lurched forward. I screamed. She laughed. Our shoulders pressed together as we twisted and turned through the air. By the time we pulled back into the station, my knuckles were white from gripping the bar, but I couldn't stop grinning. "First time?" Mary asked as we stumbled onto solid ground. "That obvious?" I smoothed my windblown hair. "I usually spend my days behind a microphone." "A radio host?" Her blue eyes sparkled with interest. "Podcast, about relationships." I paused. "Or lack thereof." She bought us cotton candy, and we wandered through the park. The setting sun painted everything in soft pinks and oranges. Mary, I learned, was a judge for local performance competitions. She had stories that made me laugh until my sides hurt. "You should come see a show sometime," she said, tearing off a piece of cotton candy. "Might give you some fresh material for your podcast." The way she said it felt like more than a casual invitation. As darkness fell and the park lights twinkled to life, we found ourselves on a bench near the carousel. The music box melody provided a soundtrack to our conversation that seemed to never end. "I haven't felt this comfortable with someone in ages," I admitted, watching children wave from painted horses. "Me neither," Mary replied softly. Her hand rested inches from mine on the bench between us. "It's rare to find someone who really listens." When the closing announcement came over the speakers, we both jumped. Had 5 hours really passed? We exchanged numbers, and I tried to ignore the flutter in my chest when our fingers brushed. Walking to my car, I couldn't stop smiling. My podcast needed fresh content, but I'd found something else entirely. Something that made my heart race more than any roller coaster. I just didn't know yet how much that chance meeting would change everything. A week after our amusement park encounter, I found myself scrolling through Mary's social media. Her profile was filled with vibrant photos from drag competitions. Each image captured such joy and authenticity that I couldn't look away. My podcast needed this energy. "You want to cover drag queen competitions?" My producer raised an eyebrow during our morning meeting. "That's different." "Different is exactly what we need," I argued, showing her Mary's profile. "Look at these performances. The stories behind them must be incredible." What I didn't mention was how I'd been unable to stop thinking about Mary's laugh, her casual confidence, the way she made me feel alive on that roller coaster. The drag scene was my excuse to see her again. I messaged her about featuring the competitions on my podcast. Her response came within minutes. "Honey, I thought you'd never ask." The venue was smaller than I'd imagined, but it pulsed with energy. Sequins caught the stage lights, creating constellations on the walls. Mary stood near the judges' table, commanding attention in a sleek black dress that made my mouth go dry. "Welcome to my world," she said, pulling me into a hug that lingered just long enough to make my heart race. "Ready to have your mind blown?" The performances were spectacular, but I found myself watching Mary more than the stage. The way she leaned forward during emotional numbers, how her eyes lit up at particularly clever performances. She caught me staring once and winked. During breaks, we did quick interviews. My microphone captured her insights about performance art and self-expression, but it missed the electricity when our fingers brushed, the way her gaze held mine longer than necessary. "You're a natural at this," she said after one segment. "Your listeners will love it." "I have a good subject," I replied, trying to sound professional despite my racing pulse. The evening stretched on, filled with music and laughter. Between performances, Mary introduced me to the competitors. Each had a story that would make incredible podcast content, but I struggled to focus when she stood so close. These queens aren't just performers, Mary explained as we watched the final number. They're storytellers, artists, warriors, each one fighting to be authentically themselves. Her words hit home. Here I was, hiding behind my microphone, using work as an excuse to be near her. The irony wasn't lost on me. After the show, we sat in the empty venue, surrounded by fallen glitter and the ghost of music. Mary shared stories about her journey into judging, her voice soft in the dim light. I never expected this to become my life, she admitted. But sometimes the best things happen when we least expect them. Our eyes met, and for a moment I thought she might kiss me. Instead, she stood and offered her hand. Same time next week? Your listeners need to hear the whole season. I took her hand, ignoring the spark that shot through me. It's a date. The word slipped out before I could stop it. Mary's smile turned playful. Is it now? Walking to my car that night, I realized I was in trouble. This wasn't just about saving my podcast anymore. With every interview, every shared laugh, every lingering look, I was falling for a woman who lived in a world so different from mine. And somehow, that made it even more thrilling. The backstage area became my second home over the next few weeks. I shadowed Mary through rehearsals, learning the intricate dance between judges and performers. The air always smelled of hairspray and anticipation, thick with dreams and glitter. Watch how they transform, Mary whispered one evening, leading me through the dressing room. It's not just makeup, it's armor. I was supposed to be gathering material for my podcast, but I found myself drawn to Mary's presence. The way she commanded respect with a gentle touch, how she could critique without crushing spirits. She was teaching me about more than just drag. Your last relationship, I ventured one night, as we sorted through competition scorecards. What happened? Mary's hands stilled. She couldn't handle the spotlight, said this world was too much. The she hung between us, an admission that made my heart skip. Thunder rumbled outside, matching the tension in her office. And you? She asked, looking up. Why did your last one end? She said I was too focused on other people's stories. I laughed softly. The irony of being a relationship podcaster who can't maintain one. Lightning flashed, illuminating Mary's face. She'd moved closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something expensive and subtle. Sometimes we need to live our own stories, she said quietly. The power went out, plunging us into darkness. I heard Mary's sharp intake of breath, felt her hand find mine in the dark. The emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in a soft blue glow. Scared of the dark? I teased, trying to calm my racing heart. No, she whispered. Scared of what I might do in it. Her thumb traced circles on my palm, sending shivers up my arm. Another crash of thunder made me jump, bringing us even closer. Tell me about your dreams, she said suddenly. Not the podcast ones, the real ones? In that blue-tinted darkness, words spilled out. I told her about wanting to write novels, about the fear of being vulnerable, about searching for a love worth documenting. She listened, really listened, the way few people ever had. When I finished, the storm had moved closer, rain drumming against the windows. Your turn, I said softly. Mary's story unfolded like poetry. Dreams of Broadway crushed by reality, finding herself in the drag scene, learning to judge not just performances but her own worth. I never thought I'd find someone who understands both worlds, she admitted. The air between us crackled with possibility. Her hand was still in mine, our shoulders touching as we sat on her office floor. Mary, I started, but thunder swallowed the rest of my words. She turned to face me, her blue eyes intense in the emergency lighting. For a moment, I thought she might kiss me. Instead, she reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. We should probably head home, she said, voice husky. Storm's getting worse. But neither of us moved. The rain created shadows that danced across her face, and I found myself memorizing every detail. The curve of her lips, the faint lines around her eyes, the way she looked at me like I was something precious. Yeah, I agreed, not meaning it. We should. The moment stretched, elastic and fragile. When we finally stood, something had shifted between us. The pretense of professional distance was wearing thin, like stage makeup after a long performance. Walking to our cars, protected by a shared umbrella, Mary said, "You're changing things around here, Callie Bennett." "Good changes?" I asked, watching raindrops catch in her hair. Her smile was soft, secret, the best kind. That night, lying in bed listening to the storm, I realized I was no longer just documenting stories. I was living one. And it terrified me how much I wanted to see how it ended. My podcast numbers were soaring. Listeners couldn't get enough of the drag scene stories, but they were really tuning in for Mary, her voice, her insights, the way she could make anyone feel seen. The comment section was filled with people asking when she'd be back. "Your audience loves you," I told her one afternoon, scrolling through reviews. "They love us," she corrected, applying mascara in her vanity mirror. "We make quite the pair." The dressing room was empty except for us. Mary had offered to teach me about stage makeup, claiming it would help me understand the transformation process better. "Sit." She patted the chair beside her. "Time for your education." My heart raced as she turned my chair to face her. The vanity lights created a halo around her blonde hair, and I struggled to maintain my composure. "First rule," she said, selecting a brush. "Makeup is about enhancement, not hiding." Her fingers were gentle as she tilted my chin up. Each touch sent electricity through my skin. She explained different techniques, but I was lost in the blue of her eyes, the way her lips moved as she spoke. "You're not listening," she chided softly. "I'm distracted," I admitted before I could stop myself. Her hand paused, hovering near my cheek. The air between us grew thick with unspoken words. She was so close I could count her eyelashes. "Distracted by what?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Instead of answering, I reached up and caught her hand. Her fingers intertwined with mine naturally, like they belonged there. "Callie," she breathed my name like a prayer. The moment stretched, taut with possibility. Then she leaned forward and everything changed. Her lips met mine softly, tentatively. The makeup brush clattered to the floor, forgotten. I melted into the kiss, tasting her expensive lipstick, feeling her smile against my mouth. When we pulled apart, her eyes were bright with emotion. "I've wanted to do that since the roller coaster," she confessed. "Why didn't you?" "Timing, fear, take your pick." She traced my cheekbone with her thumb, but mainly I wanted to be sure. Sure of what? That this wasn't just about your podcast. I pulled her back in for another kiss, this one deeper, more certain. "The podcast was just an excuse to see you again." She laughed against my lips. "I know, honey. I'm not blind." The rest of the makeup lesson was forgotten. We sat there, trading kisses and confessions, the vanity lights warming our skin. Mary told me about watching me during shows, how she'd catch herself smiling whenever I asked questions. "You're different," she said, playing with my fingers. "You see beyond the glitter." "You make it easy," I replied. "You're the most authentic person I know." The afternoon slipped away from us. Outside, we could hear the venue coming to life, preparing for tonight's show. But in our bubble of light and warmth, time seemed suspended. "We should probably get ready," Mary said eventually, though she made no move to let go of my hand. "Probably," I agreed, equally reluctant. As we finally stood to prepare for the evening's competition, Mary pulled me close one more time. "This changes things," she whispered. "Good changes?" I echoed her words from that rainy night. Her kiss was answer enough. We separated just as the first performers started arriving, but something fundamental had shifted. My podcast might have been about relationships, but for the first time, I was living the kind of love story I used to only talk about. That night's show felt different. Every time Mary spoke, I heard the softness in her voice from our private moments. When our eyes met across the judges' table, the world seemed to pause. I touched my lips during quiet moments, still feeling the ghost of her kisses. My notebook remained empty. Tonight's stories would have to wait. I was too busy living one of my own. Word travels fast in small communities. Within days of our first kiss, whispers rippled through Aurora's drag scene. I noticed the knowing looks, the subtle nods when Mary and I entered rooms together. "They're talking about us," I murmured during a competition break. Mary squeezed my hand under the judges' table. "Let them talk, honey." But it wasn't that simple. My podcast audience picked up on the change in my voice whenever Mary appeared. The comments section filled with speculation about our relationship. "Your chemistry is electric," one listener wrote. "Are you dating the judge?" asked another. I stared at my laptop screen, cursor blinking in the empty reply box. How could I explain something I was still trying to understand myself? The real complications started during the semifinals. A contestant named Diamond Destiny approached me after her performance. "The scores seem different lately," she said, eyes sharp beneath false lashes. "Ever since you and Mary got close." My stomach dropped. "The judging is completely fair." "Is it?" Diamond's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Because some of us have noticed patterns." I watched Mary across the room, confidently delivering feedback to another performer. She was brilliant at her job, passionate about nurturing talent. The suggestion that our relationship might compromise that made me feel sick. That night, in Mary's apartment, I couldn't shake Diamond's words. "Maybe we should be more discreet," I suggested, picking at my dinner. Mary set down her wine glass. "Are you ashamed of this?" "Never." I reached for her hand. "I'm worried about your reputation." "My reputation?" She laughed softly. "Honey, I've spent years building respect in this community. They know me." But the whispers grew louder. My podcast ratings soared, but the comments became more pointed. Some suggested I was using the drag scene for views. Others questioned Mary's objectivity. During one particularly tense evening, a competing podcast host cornered me. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Being the reason a respected judge might lose her credibility?" I fled to the bathroom, hands shaking as I called my producer. "Maybe we should pivot," she suggested. "Focus on different stories for a while." But the drag scene episodes are our most popular. Because people love drama, Callie, and right now, you're creating it. I splashed water on my face, watching my reflection blur through tears. When I opened the door, Mary stood waiting. I heard what she said. She pulled me into her arms. "Don't let them get to you." "But what if they're right?" I whispered into her shoulder. "What if I'm ruining everything you've built?" Mary pulled back, cupping my face in her hands. "Listen to me. What we have is real. Everything else is just noise." But that night, watching her sleep, I wondered if love was enough. The drag scene had been her home long before I arrived with my microphone and questions. The next morning, headlines on local LGBTQ blogs speculated about favoritism in recent competition results. Mary's name appeared in most of them. "We need to talk about this," I said, showing her my phone. She read the articles silently, her face unreadable. Finally, she looked up. "Do you trust me?" "Of course." "Then trust that I can handle this. I faced worse criticism." But I saw the strain in her smile, noticed how she spent longer reviewing scores, second-guessing decisions she used to make confidently. During the next competition, I sat in the audience instead of beside her at the judges' table. The distance felt wrong, but necessary. Mary's eyes found mine between performances, and I saw both understanding and sadness in them. Later, in the empty venue, she found me collecting my recording equipment. "This isn't the answer," she said softly. "Then what is?" She pulled me close, kissing me with a fierce certainty that made my doubts waver. "We figure it out together. That's what couples do." The word couples sent warmth through my chest, even as fear lingered. We were navigating uncharted territory, trying to balance professional integrity with personal happiness. As we left the venue that night, hand in hand, I realized something. The stories I'd always told on my podcast were about love's challenges. Now I was living one, complete with all its complications and beauty. The whispers would continue, but maybe they didn't matter. What mattered was the way Mary looked at me, how our fingers fit together, and the certainty that some things were worth fighting for. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I was editing my latest podcast episode when my producer called, her voice tight with concern. "Have you seen Real Talk, Aurora's latest post?" I hadn't. Opening their website made my blood run cold. There, in high definition, were private moments between Mary and me. Us kissing in what we thought was an empty dressing room. Holding hands behind the judge's table. Intimate conversations caught on someone's phone. Inside Aurora's drag scene, "Love, Bias, and the Death of Fair Competition," screamed the headline. My hands shook as I scrolled through the article. They'd interviewed eliminated contestants, including Diamond Destiny, who claimed Mary's scoring had become suspiciously favorable to performers who supported our relationship. "This is a hit piece," I whispered into the phone. "It's trending," my producer replied gently. "We need to address it." Before I could respond, texts flooded my phone. Mary's name flashed on screen. "We need to talk, now." I found her in her office, pacing. The usual warmth was gone from her eyes, replaced by something harder, more wounded. 15 years, she said as I entered. 15 years building my reputation in this community. "Mary, I'm so sorry. They're calling for my resignation from the judges' panel." Her laugh was bitter. "Apparently, I can't be trusted to remain objective while dating you." The word dating had never sounded so painful. I reached for her, but she stepped back. "Maybe we should take a break," I suggested, the words burning my throat. "From the podcast coverage, I mean." "A break?" She stopped pacing. "You mean run away?" "No, I mean protect what you've built. These competitions mean everything to you. You mean everything to me too." Her voice cracked. "But right now, I can't tell if you're trying to save my career or escape the scandal." The accusation stung because part of me wondered the same thing. Was I being noble or cowardly? My phone buzzed again, my producer suggesting we suspend the drag scene episodes. Mary watched me read the message, her expression darkening. "Go ahead," she said quietly. "Pull back. It's what you do best, isn't it?" "That's not fair, isn't it? You hide behind your microphone, Callie. Recording other people's stories because you're afraid to live your own." Her words hit like physical blows. Because she was right. I'd spent years documenting relationships while keeping myself safely distant from real intimacy. "I'm not hiding now," I argued. "I'm trying to protect you." "I don't need protection. I need someone who won't disappear when things get difficult." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside her office, we could hear the venue coming to life, performers arriving for tonight's competition. "I should go," I said finally. "Give you space to handle this." "Space?" Mary's laugh was hollow. "Honey, space is the last thing I need from you right now." But I was already backing toward the door, fear and shame churning in my gut. "I'll cancel the upcoming episodes. Let things cool down." "And us?" Her voice was barely audible. "Are you canceling us too?" I couldn't answer. Instead, I fled, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed me through the venue. In my car, I finally broke down. My phone kept buzzing, messages from listeners, competitors, my producer, but the only message I wanted to see never came. That night's competition happened without me. I sat in my apartment, staring at my recording equipment, wondering how something that had brought me such joy could now feel so poisonous. The Real Talk article continued to spread. Comments poured in, some supportive, others cruel. But the loudest voice was my own conscience, asking if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. Because in trying to protect Mary's world, I might have just destroyed the best part of mine. 3 days of silence felt like an eternity. I'd stopped checking my podcast comments, ignored calls from my producer, and watched my phone for messages from Mary that never came. On the 4th day, I made a decision. If I was going to understand Mary's world truly, I needed to do more than observe from behind a microphone. "You want to what?" Diamond Destiny's surprise was evident even through the phone. "I want you to transform me, help me perform." There was a long pause. "Does Mary know about this?" "No," I admitted. "But I need to understand, really understand." Diamond agreed, perhaps out of curiosity or guilt over the article's fallout. The next afternoon, I found myself in her home studio, surrounded by wigs and costumes. "First lesson," she said, studying my face. "Drag isn't about hiding, it's about revealing." Hours passed as Diamond worked her magic. Foundation, contour, false lashes that felt heavy on my eyes. Each layer added something new, something brave. "Look," she finally said, turning me toward the mirror. I barely recognized myself. The woman staring back was both stranger and truth, vulnerable and powerful. "Now for the hard part," Diamond smiled. "Walking in heels." The training was intense. Diamond taught me to walk, to lip sync, to command attention. My muscles ached, my feet blistered, but something inside me was awakening. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked during a break. Because I've been telling everyone else's stories, I replied, adjusting my wig. It's time to live my own. A week later, I signed up for amateur night. Diamond helped me choose my song, The Show Must Go On, by Queen. The irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't tell Mary. But somehow, as I stood backstage that night, I knew she'd be there. The drag community was too small for secrets. My hands shook as I peeked through the curtain. The venue was packed, and there, at the judges' table, sat Mary. Even from a distance, I could see her tension, the way she gripped her pen too tightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced, "please welcome making her debut, Miss Callie Confessions." The music started, and I stepped into the spotlight. Everything Diamond had taught me flew from my mind. But then I caught Mary's eye, saw her mouth fall open in recognition, and something clicked. This wasn't about performing. It was about being brave enough to be seen. I poured everything into that performance, my fear, my love, my regret. The lyrics became my confession, each gesture a plea for understanding. When the music ended, the audience cheered, but I only saw Mary, who sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face. Backstage, still shaking from adrenaline, I heard her voice. "What do you think you're doing?" I turned. Mary stood in the doorway, looking beautiful and fierce. "Understanding," I said simply. "Finally understanding." She crossed the space between us, her hand reaching up to touch my transformed face. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did. I've been hiding behind my microphone, afraid to really live. But you taught me that authenticity requires courage." "You're shaking," she noticed, taking my hands. "These heels are killing me," I admitted. She laughed then, a real laugh that broke the tension. "Your makeup is running." "I don't care." I squeezed her hands. "I'm done caring about appearances. I love you, Mary Cooper. And I'm not running anymore." The kiss that followed was different from our others, deeper, more certain. My false lashes got in the way, my wig slightly askew, but it was perfect. Later that night, after I'd removed the makeup and costume, we lay tangled together in her bed. Mary traced patterns on my skin, her touch sending shivers through me. "You were beautiful up there," she murmured. I was terrified. "That's what made it beautiful." She propped herself up on an elbow. "You faced your fear." "For you," I said softly. "No, honey." She kissed me gently. "For yourself. That's what makes it matter." She was right. In trying to understand her world, I'd finally found my own courage. And as we drifted to sleep, I realized that sometimes the best stories aren't the ones we tell, they're the ones we dare to live. News of my performance spread through Aurora's drag community like wildfire. The video, captured by several audience members, went viral in local LGBTQ circles. But what surprised me most was the response. "You showed real courage," Diamond told me at the next competition. "We might have judged you both too harshly." Other queens approached with similar sentiments. The same performers who'd once whispered about favoritism now shared their own stories of love and authenticity. "Your podcast," Mary suggested one evening. "Why not let them tell their real stories?" So I did. My show evolved from relationship advice to chronicles of genuine love in all its forms. The queens opened up about their journeys, their struggles, their triumphs. Each episode felt less like reporting and more like sharing sacred truths. "These stories matter," one queen said during recording. "They show people they're not alone." Mary sat in on every interview, her presence a quiet strength. The way she interacted with the performers, drawing out their vulnerability while protecting their dignity, made me fall even deeper in love. But the real test came when Mary decided it was time for me to meet her family. "They're traditional," she warned as we drove to her parents' house in the suburbs. "But they're trying." The modest home looked like any other on the street. Mary's mother opened the door, her smile careful but genuine. "So this is the podcast lady," she said, pulling me into an unexpected hug. Inside, family photos covered the walls, young Mary in dance recitals, school plays, graduation. Her father sat in his armchair, watching us with guarded curiosity. "Mary says you're a storyteller," he said finally. "I try to be," I replied, accepting a glass of iced tea from her mother. "Tell us one," he challenged. "Tell us your story with our daughter." Mary tensed beside me, but I took her hand. The truth was all we had. I told them about the roller coaster, about finding love when I least expected it, about learning to be brave enough to live my own story instead of just telling others. And the drag shows? Her mother asked quietly. They're about authenticity, I explained. About having the courage to be who you really are. Something shifted in her father's expression. Like Mary had the courage to tell us who she really was? Exactly like that. I squeezed Mary's hand. Dinner was a careful dance of questions and answers, but as the evening progressed, I watched Mary's parents soften. Her mother asked about my podcast, genuinely interested. Her father shared stories of Mary's childhood performances. She was always meant for the stage, he said fondly. We just didn't know which stage. Later, as Mary's mother cleared dessert plates, she pulled me aside. We worry, she admitted, about the judgment she faces, the cruel things people say. I know, I replied. I worry too, but your daughter is the strongest person I know. She touched my cheek, a motherly gesture that made my throat tight. Thank you for seeing her, really seeing her. The drive home was quiet, Mary lost in thought. That went better than expected, she finally said. They love you, I replied. That's a good foundation for understanding. She pulled into her driveway but didn't turn off the engine. You know what made the difference? What? You. The way you told our story. You made them see it wasn't about scandal or shock. It was about love. That night, curled together on her couch, we watched old videos of drag competitions. The transformation of nervous newcomers into confident performers reminded me of my own journey. The community's changing, Mary observed. Opening up, healing. She was right. The whispers had turned to celebrations. The suspicion had become support. Our love story had somehow helped bridge divides we hadn't even known existed. Your next podcast episode, Mary said sleepily, should be about family. Which family? I asked. Yours, mine? All of them, she murmured. The ones we're born into, the ones we choose, the ones we build together. As she drifted off in my arms, I thought about families and stories and courage, about how love, when given room to grow, can transform not just two people but entire communities. And I knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning of our story. The email arrived on a quiet Sunday morning. Mary was still asleep beside me when I read it, the blue light of my phone illuminating her peaceful face. Dear Miss Cooper, it began, we're impressed by your work in Aurora's drag scene. The National Drag Association would like to offer you a position on our judging panel in New York City. My heart stopped. This was huge, the kind of opportunity Mary had dreamed about. But New York was across the country, far from everything we'd built here. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her. In the kitchen, I made coffee and tried to sort through my emotions. The smell of brewing coffee eventually drew Mary out. You're up early, she yawned, then noticed my expression. What's wrong? I handed her my phone. Watched her eyes widen as she read, her hand trembling slightly. New York, she whispered. It's an amazing opportunity, I said carefully. She set the phone down, wrapping her hands around a coffee mug. It's not just an opportunity, it's everything I've worked for. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, she looked at me. Come with me. The words hung in the air between us. What? Your podcast can be recorded anywhere. You've built a following. They'll follow you to New York. She was right. Technically, I could work from anywhere. But Aurora had become more than just a location. It was where our story began. I need time to think, I said softly. The next few days were a dance of careful conversations. We discussed logistics, possibilities, fears. Mary reached out to contacts in New York while I researched podcast studios. The drag scene there is incredible, she said one evening. Think of the stories you could tell. But it wasn't just about stories anymore. It was about leaving our community, our support system, the family we'd built. I called my producer, expecting resistance. Instead, she was enthusiastic. New York could take your show national, she said. Plus, your love story in the big city. Listeners will eat it up. Still, I hesitated. Mary noticed, of course. She always did. Talk to me, she said one night, finding me on her balcony. What are you afraid of? Losing what we have here, I admitted. What if New York changes us? She wrapped her arms around me from behind. Change isn't always bad, honey. But what if? No what ifs, she interrupted. Just truth. Do you love me? More than anything. Do you believe in us? I turned in her arms. Yes. Then the rest is just geography. But it wasn't that simple, and we both knew it. The next competition night, watching Mary in her element, I realized what I was really afraid of. I'm scared of holding you back, I confessed later. What if you resent me for making you choose? Choose? She looked puzzled. Between New York and me? Her laugh was soft, tender. Honey, I'm not choosing between anything. I'm choosing us together, wherever that takes us. The certainty in her voice made something shift inside me. We'd faced whispers and judgment, family tensions and community drama, and we'd emerged stronger. That night, I opened my laptop and began researching apartments in New York. Mary found me still at it hours later. Does this mean? I nodded. I'm scared. But I'm more scared of not taking this leap with you. She pulled me into a kiss that tasted of joy and promise. When we broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine. We'll build something beautiful there, she whispered. Just like we did here. Together? I agreed. The next morning, Mary accepted the position. As we shared the news with our community, I was struck by their reactions, not sadness at our leaving, but celebration of our next chapter. You'll always have a home here, Diamond said, hugging us both. Looking at Mary's radiant smile, I knew we were making the right choice, because home wasn't about place, it was about the person you chose to build it with. And I'd chosen Mary, with all the adventures and uncertainties that came with her. New York wasn't an ending, it was just the next page in our story. With 2 weeks left before our move to New York, I sat in my recording studio, staring at the microphone. This would be my last episode from Aurora, and I knew exactly what story I needed to tell. Today's episode is different, I began, my voice soft but steady. It's about my own love story. The words flowed easily, perhaps because I'd been living them. I told my listeners about the roller coaster ride, about falling in love with a drag competition judge, about learning to be brave enough to live authentically. Love isn't just about finding someone, I said into the microphone. It's about becoming who you're meant to be with them. Mary found me after I finished recording, tears in her eyes. She'd been listening from the control room. That was beautiful, she whispered, pulling me close. It's our truth, I replied simply. That evening, at the venue, Mary had her own surprise planned. I noticed something was different as soon as we arrived. The energy was electric, the queens unusually secretive. What's going on? I asked Diamond, who just winked and hurried backstage. Mary squeezed my hand. You'll see. The show began normally enough, but after the third performance, the lights changed. Soft blue illuminated the stage as Mary stood up from the judges' table. Tonight, she announced, we have a special tribute performance. The music started, our song from the roller coaster day. Then, one by one, the queens emerged, each wearing an outfit that represented a chapter of our story. Diamond appeared in the amusement park uniform. Another queen wore my podcast headphones. A third strutted out in the outfit from my first drag performance. I watched, mesmerized, as our love story unfolded on stage. Each performer added their own touch while maintaining the thread of our narrative. Then Mary appeared in the spotlight, wearing a dress that matched the one from our first kiss. This is for you, Callie Bennett, she said into the microphone. The woman who taught me that love is the greatest performance of all. She began to lip sync, not to a pop song, but to a montage of clips from my podcast. My voice filled the venue, talking about love and courage and authenticity. The performance ended with all the queens forming a heart shape around Mary. The audience erupted in applause, but I barely heard them through my tears. Mary made her way to me through the crowd. Surprise, she whispered. How did you? The community wanted to give us a proper send-off. She wiped a tear from my cheek. They've been rehearsing for weeks. One by one, the queens came to hug us. Each had a story about how our relationship had affected them. You showed us that love wins, Diamond said, her usual sass softened by emotion. That authenticity matters, added another queen. That sometimes the best stories are the ones we're afraid to tell, said a third. The celebration lasted late into the night. Our community, our family, surrounded us with love and support. Even those who had once whispered about favoritism now raised toasts to our future. Later, in the quiet of Mary's apartment, surrounded by half-packed boxes, she held me close. Thank you, she murmured into my hair. For what? For being brave enough to love me publicly, for telling our story, for choosing us. I turned to face her. Thank you for giving me a story worth telling. She kissed me then, soft and sweet, tasting of champagne and promises. Outside, Aurora's lights twinkled like stars, reminding me of that first night on the roller coaster. New York won't know what hit it. She smiled against my lips. No, I agreed. But they're about to learn that the best love stories don't follow a script. As we drifted to sleep that night, I thought about how far we'd come. From a chance meeting on a roller coaster to becoming a symbol of love's transformative power. Our story had changed us, changed our community, and now it would change New York too. Because that's what real love does. It transforms everything it touches. And this was just the beginning. 1 year after our first meeting, Mary and I stood in the line for the Thunderbolt roller coaster. The summer heat felt familiar, comforting even, as we waited our turn. Can't believe you convinced me to do this again, I laughed, watching the car zoom overhead. Tradition, Mary replied, squeezing my hand. Before we leave for New York tomorrow. The past year had transformed everything. My podcast had evolved into something deeper, more authentic. Mary's reputation in the drag community had grown stronger, and our love had become a story people told when they needed hope. Remember how terrified I was? I asked as we moved forward in line. Honey, you're still terrified, she teased. But now you do it anyway. The line shuffled forward. Above us, screams and laughter filled the air, just like that first day. But something felt different. Maybe it was us. Single riders? The attendant asked, just like before. No, Mary answered, smiling. We're together. As we climbed into the car, I noticed Mary's hands trembling slightly. I assumed it was from excitement until I saw her expression, nervous, almost uncertain. Everything okay? I asked as the safety bar lowered. She nodded, but her smile seemed different. The ride lurched forward, climbing the first hill. Callie, she said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the mechanical clicks. I need to ask you something. Now? I laughed, gripping the bar tighter as we neared the peak. Now. She reached into her pocket, and my heart stopped. The world paused at the top of that first drop. Mary held out a small box, opened it with shaking hands. Marry me? She asked, just as we plummeted. My scream mixed with laughter and tears as we twisted through the air. The ring glinted in the sunlight, somehow staying secure in its box despite the G-forces. When the ride finally stopped, my hands were still shaking. Mary looked at me expectantly, hopefully. Yes, I whispered, then louder, yes. The crowd around us burst into applause as she slipped the ring onto my finger. Someone recognized us from the drag shows and started chanting our names. We spent the rest of the afternoon reliving our first date, cotton candy, carousel rides, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of promise. Why here? I asked later, as we sat on our bench near the carousel. Why not wait until New York? Mary's smile was soft in the twilight. Because this is where our story began, and I wanted that story to come full circle before we start our next chapter. The music box melody of the carousel played behind us, just like before. But this time, when our hands met on the bench between us, a ring caught the light. You know what this means? She said, eyes twinkling. You'll have to update your podcast title. Callie Confessions doesn't quite fit anymore. How about Cooper Confessions? I suggested. Her kiss was answer enough. As the park's closing announcement echoed through the speakers, we walked hand in hand to the exit. The Thunderbolt silhouette stood against the darkening sky, a monument to beginnings and endings and the courage to embrace both. Ready for New York? Mary asked as we reached the car. I looked at my ring, then at her, my judge, my love, my future wife. Ready for everything. Because that's what our story had taught us. Love isn't just about the big moments, the roller coaster proposals or drag show declarations. It's about choosing each other every day, through fear and change and uncertainty. And as we drove away from Embellished Gardens, I knew this wasn't really an ending. It was just the beginning of a different kind of ride. one we'd take together, hand in hand, into whatever adventures awaited us. Some might call it a fairy tale ending, but I prefer to think of it as a real love story, messy and beautiful and absolutely perfectly ours.